Hello, in this video we're going to be looking at how to design the PowerPoint for your simulation. And the idea here is that when you actually run the simulation, you're going to have a PowerPoint. You're going to have some kind of way of sharing with people the directions, the instructions for the simulation, and helping you remember what you're supposed to do. Because I can tell you from running these things, you're going to be running around, you're going to be helping different groups, and it's really easy to forget what you're supposed to do. It's easy to forget what events come up and so on and so forth. And also it's important because it really sets the mood when you have some nice pictures, especially when you can connect them directly to the simulation. Now, so for example, I have a lot of pictures of people farming, and these are typically, as far as I can tell, at least based on what Wikipedia Commons has to say, these are paintings of Ukraine. So it helps to really set the mood that way. And we also talked about the importance. You may remember last time we have sat down and we have organized what a typical turn would look like, and then we thought of events that would impact the mechanics of the turn, right? So, okay, this is a normal harvest check, but then, collectivization is going on, so you have to subtract 2 successes. Usually when I do these simulations, the first thing I like to do is give people the board, right? I want them to be able, because they're going to have to put stuff on the board. It kind of gets things going, hopefully gets them in the mood. And I like to have a PowerPoint of the board so I can jump back and forth and more easily show them, okay, this is where you do things. But if you're dealing with a new group, you tell them, okay, so here's a board. You can see that there's a place marked wealth and hidden food. You're going to put counters there that show how wealth and hidden food you have. You have these economic contribution things. You have the total food needed. You're going to put a marker there that tells us those numbers. Don't worry about it. I'll tell you the numbers later momentarily. And I can also point out, okay, here's the random character selector if I want to. And one thing you can do, what's nice thing about PowerPoint is you can put the images of the board wherever you want. You may want to walk through these things one by one, and you can have a slide with your board, and so you can easily find this. For now, I can go back and forth relatively easily. But the idea is I like to give them the board, and I like to just explain it and say, this is the board. We're going to use this to keep track of our resources and to understand what we need to do in order to survive the Holodomor. And it's also fine just to tell people, say, don't worry, a lot of this stuff isn't going to make sense. It will make sense as we continue. I think it's easy to spend a lot of time trying to explain all the instructions, but people will forget them almost immediately. It's better just to play through and explain things as they come up. So we need then to set up the board. So the first thing is and again, this is where it helps you to have the instructions up there because it's easy to forget. So divide into pairs with one group of 3 if there's an odd number, and distribute individual cards. So I'll tell students, okay, you two. Oh, I see we've got a group of 3. That's fine. You're a group of 3. And then I go around and give them and I say, you're going to receive one of these cards. This is who you're going to be playing in this simulation, right? This is who you're going to be playing. And you can see you've got the person's name, you've got their role in the family. These other things, I'll tell you later what they mean. And then I pan out the cards. And it's easy to forget to give people the cards. It's easy to forget to do this stuff. That's why you have it up there. And then I tell them, okay, everyone takes their health counters equal to their starting health on the card. And then notice I have an image of health counters up there. And I should have, by this time, given them like a plastic box. And this will remind me, if I didn't give them the plastic box, to give them the plastic box that has the health counters and these other counters in them. And I say, okay, you'll see that it says starting health on your card. Take that many health counters. And then what I do is, this is why it's very important. You don't want to just have this up. You want to animate these. You want to be able to control which bullet point shows when, because you want to make sure, okay, everyone's done. Okay, let's move to the next step. Then the next step, I say, okay, place health counters on the children's sections of the board as noted in their health. And you can see, we go back up here, I can go back and just point to this and say, okay, look, there you can see this, Igor starts off with 4, Sophia starts with 4, and Nina starts with only 2. And then I tell people, okay, play 4 wealth counters in the wealth section of the board. And I can point up there. That's what a wealth counter looks like. And again, you want to make it really clear to people, especially a lot of people, they may be kind of confused if they're not familiar with this sort of thing. You want to keep them engaged. You want to keep them comfortable. And it's pretty easy to do so. You just put the images up there. It helps them to follow along. You then place the 4 food counters in the hidden food portion of the board. And I want to stress, I have not yet play tested this. And that's one reason why it's nice to use PowerPoint, because if you mess up, it's really easy to fix. Because I could easily make this 3 if I think it's too easy. I can make it, or if I think the simulation is too easy. If I think the simulation is too hard, I can make it 5. And then I say, okay, place a food counter on the 12 in the total food needs section. And then I have it in there, 14 if you have Katerina in your group. And this just makes it easier. Instead of saying to students, okay, add up all your economic contributions and so on and so forth, people get confused by that, I have found. So it's better, on the first turn, everyone starts the same. Just give them the information. And then I have place an economic contribution marker on the 14 in both economic contribution sections. And I can go back and say, because that one may be confusing. I'm like, okay, here's where you'd put it. Here's where you'd put that. And then I note 16 on the female one if you have Katerina in your group. And this is where it's very important to kind of play test and talk these things out, because I just realized I want to keep this in because I want you to see why it's important to do these things in terms of quality. There it goes up to 16. You'll notice that my board only goes up to 14 for economic contribution. So that's a problem that needs to be resolved. And that's easy enough to resolve because generally people aren't going to drop that low, or I can make the font smaller. I can do something, but it needs to go up to at least 16, right? My error, but that's what's important about these things. That's something you figure out through play testing. These things aren't going to go perfect the first time. There's a lot of moving parts. So I'll leave that in there just so you can see why this is so important that we talk through these things. So then I need to share with people the turn order. And I just want to note this image is, again, sometimes you have an image that you'll talk about historically, and sometimes you want something that sets a theme. And sometimes I like to do something that shows continuity. So I can tell people, say, okay, we're setting this in the Ukraine, or in Ukraine. It's important to understand that this is a living culture. This is a Ukrainian woman today, a contemporary image. And this is the kind of bread that is made to celebrate various events. And this just is meant to, like I say, to emphasize this is a living culture. So the turn order, okay, I tell everyone, okay, here's your deck of cards right now. And I should have also handed out, I have to add this, to hand out the dice, right? I have to hand out dice, and I tell people to and I have to hand out the deck of cards. So that's something I need to remember to add, right? I need to add in where they get their dice. I need to give them a deck of cards. And I need to talk about the failure and success, and I need to get that chart in there, right? So here's a problem, and I want to leave this in. I know how the simulation works, but the people I'm presenting it to may not. And it's easy to forget what other people don't know, if that makes sense. So I need to make sure that the rules are in there, that I explain what failures and successes are, and then I talk about, okay, here's your chart. You may remember that red and green chart I make. There, you need to keep that chart, and this is how you use it. That's fine. Like I say, that's why you talk through these things. So I tell people, okay, draw a card and make adjustments as needed. And all right, now we're going to do our harvest check. And so basically I tell people, okay, Vladimir and Vera, you each roll a number of D6 equal to the respective economic contribution on your board, right? So it's like 14, right? You're each going to roll 14 dice and count then the number of successes, right? Count then the number of successes. So I'm giving them the instruction. So when the first time you do this is going to take a while. So I just say, okay, roll your dice and put them on the board. Okay. Now count your number of successes, right? And actually what I want to do is I want to say count the total number. It helps to have very, very clear words there, because people will have trouble, and you want to go around and you check them the first time. So you go say, count the total number of successes for all players. If the number of successes is greater than the amount of food needed as noted on the board, right? We had total food needed. Add the difference in food counters to the hidden food section, right? So, and I can give them an example. Let's say that you needed 12 food, you rolled 16 successes, you get to add 4 food to the hidden food section. And the first round, I'll actually go around with each group and go through the calculations with them. Once people have done it once or twice, they understand. But you got on the first few rounds, you got to take your time. And I tell people if the number is less, you must use wealth to purchase food. One wealth buys one food until you have purchased food equal to what is needed, or you run out of wealth. Now I can make the rule that you don't have to. You could just lose that. You could actually opt to just suffer health losses and keep your food. I decided for simplicity's sake not to do that. So then I have rules for the starvation health loss. I say, I had this question, were you unable to feed everyone? And I'm looking for a show of hands. I say, okay. Because if no one has been unable to feed anyone, like if everyone fed anyone, we can skip this. We'll just go on ahead. If some hands go up, I'll say, okay, everyone pay attention. This is important because this will happen to you. So please pay attention here. Then for each missing food, roll on the random table to deduct one health from that person. And I can hold up the board, or I can have another image of the board and say, here's the random table. If that person loses all their health counters, they die. A player can choose to lose one of their own health counters to prevent someone else from losing their last one. If anyone dies, let me know, and lower the relevant economic contribution and total food needed to reflect their loss. Right. So that's basically the rules there. And I do want to note, you may notice one change. When I initially wrote up my turn list, I said the first thing I was going to have people do was calculate their economic contribution, the total economic contribution and total food needed. And then as I was working through the PowerPoint and putting this up in a way that, thinking about, okay, this is how I'm going to talk to people, right? The organization notes, that's written for myself. The PowerPoint is for other people in a sense. I realized it didn't make sense to do it that way, to have people calculate at the beginning of each turn their economic contribution and total food. I'm like, they don't need to do that because it stays the same unless a card changes it or unless someone dies. It's going to stay the same. So I just need to remind people, if someone dies, then you change it. If your card changes it, then you change it. So the key thing here is that I had to think of how to do things when I was organizing it. And then I found as I put it on the PowerPoint, it made sense to do a little bit differently. And that's fine. That's good, right? That's why you have to kind of go through this process of play testing and talking things out. So I then needed to explain, okay, that was a pretty good harvest, and this is where I'm giving people the history, and the government decides to set the quotas based on that good harvest, right? And I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but this is where I can give like a little mini lecture and explain what's going on here about how the government was trying to extract grain for modernization. And then I say, and then also the government decides that they're going to engage in collectivization, right? And I say that's kind of a problem because it's not going to be as efficient and people are just not going to work as hard. It's mostly designed to help the government extract more wealth. And I can go into more detail there when I actually give the presentation. But for now, I'm just trying to get the ideas. And just so you know, the photos, this is just a Ukrainian man harvesting. I thought that made sense, and it's a pleasant picture. Here, I can mention the promise of collectivization. The idea of collectivization was it would actually be more efficient because individual farmers maybe can't afford to buy a tractor, but a collective could. And that would allow you to be able to grow food more efficiently and you'd have better production. That was the theory. It's not a bad theory, it just didn't work. And then I'll also point out, and then here's the problem. There was a drought as well. So you had it about the same time. You have this kind of multiple things coming together. You have a quota is set based on a good harvest. You have a drought that reduces the harvest, but they keep the quota the same. And then you have collectivization, which actually reduces productivity, but you still keep that original high quota. So you're going to be extracting more food from the countryside than the countryside can produce while still feeding the peasants. And that's why you're going to have this really bizarre circumstance where Ukraine, even though it's like a breadbasket, is going to be starving. Even though it's making all this food that's going to go feed people everywhere, Ukraine itself will be starving, and the people in the countryside will be starving even more because that's where the food is really being taken out of. And you may ask, why are you showing this image? One is just contrast. Is that I have this image of water, and I'm talking about drought because I want to show how things normally are. I also couldn't find a picture of a drought in Ukraine. But I wanted to say, and I can say, look, you have a drought, that pond is going to disappear or it's going to get really, really low. You might not be able to support as many ducks. She's there to watch ducks that they're going to eat later. That's a problem, right? If you're going to have your food supply go down, right? You're not going to have access to that water to feed your livestock, to harvest your crops. And then we would go through the turns. And I just want to know, you can copy and paste this and it's fine. You just do the same kind of thing. But there, notice I added in bold, subtract 2 for collectivization, right? So I added that new step to help people remember, oh, because of collectivization, we need to subtract more. And then I just go through the rules once again. And then I say, okay, here's another event. The government is increasing its demand for grain. So now you have 3 minuses on your harvest check. So then we go through that turn again. And hope someone by now is probably starving. By this time, we have already gone through several turns. And so I wanted to do something other than just say, okay, you have additional minuses to your harvest check. And I want to do this in a way that says something about the history. So one thing that happened is that the officials would more aggressively, during the famine, come to try and extract grain from the farm. Basically, what happened was the Soviet Union's government, Stalin in particular, said, well, the fact that we're not getting the grain we want from Ukraine has nothing to do with our policy or the bad weather or anything like that. It has to do with bad peasants hoarding grain and not wanting to turn over the state. Now, it is somewhat true that they were hoarding grain and not wanting to turn over the state. And that's because, first of all, A, no one likes to pay taxes, but B, the state was trying to take more than they could give without them starving. But in any case, what happened was the government said, this is the cause of this is not our policy. It's criminal activity. If you as an official do not go after criminal activity, you yourself must be a criminal, in which case you'll be shot. So officials were very zealous in going out to try and look for grain. So I wanted to simulate that and to make it a little bit different. This time there is a cunning check instead of a harvest check. And I can just tell people this works the same, but you roll your cunning, which is on your card, right? And then you add it together. And then I have, what happens if you have 5 or more successes and I have a description, you trick the officials to believe you not have any hidden food and they left without taking anything. And then I said, okay, if you have 4 or 5 successes, they were only able to find some food, remove 1 food counter. If you do not have any food, they randomly beat 1 family member who loses 1 health. If you have 2 or 3 successes, they found and took all of your hidden food. If you do not have any food, they randomly beat 2 family members who each lose 2 health. And I use the word random there because there's that random chart. And then if you have less than 2 successes, they found and took all of your hidden food and randomly beat a family member who loses 1 health. So notice it's a little bit worse. And then here's the thing is, whenever you have a resource that can run out, what do you do if the players don't have any more of that resource? You say, oh, okay, I guess nothing happens. No, something bad has to happen, right? You fail to roll, something bad happens. So I just said, okay, you get beaten up, right? That's how I dealt with that, because that's the other resource is health. So that's how you can kind of deal with it. That makes things a little bit of a change. It makes things a little bit more interesting. So it's like, oh no, what's going to happen next? So then we have our usual turn order. And notice I have in bold to remind people, this time you subtract 3 successes for increasing demands. Keep going. And then we have a new event. So I decided that I had mentioned earlier that there was this issue with Ukrainians wanting to flee from the countryside to the city or even flee Ukraine if they could. And I decided, okay, let's have that happen. So I say, okay, Igor leaves a note saying he cannot endure being hungry any longer and is fleeing to the city with his girlfriend. And this is where sometimes images can add something, because I was trying to find like a good image to signify running away, and I was struggling with that. And then I noticed that there was this really nice image in Wikipedia Commons of this young man and young woman together. And I thought, well, why not add that? What maybe Igor, there's more than just being hungry. Maybe he wants to marry. They're in love. I'm not sure. But it was nice to kind of add that in and say, that extra human element that makes Igor not just someone who produces food, but someone who has a life, right? And has his own ability to make decisions. And here he says, I want to leave. So he leaves, and I ask this question, you have to decide, do you send an adult to look for him? You can't send one of your kids, they're too young, and in which case they lose their economic contribution, and they will also lose 1 health because they won't be eating while they're away, or just let him go. And one thing I'll tell you with simulations, a lot of times people are just going to say, yeah, we just let him go because we don't want to take the risk. And you can encourage them to say, think about this is your son, but also it is a famine. time, and it's really hard to survive without that economic contribution. And hopefully people will at least stop and look at how much food they have and think, can we risk it? That's kind of the idea. And then I have to remind that if you send someone lower the economic contribution and total food needed to reflect their departure, whether you look or not, reduce male economic contribution to reflect Igor's departure. And I put up there, he gives 4, and reduce food needed to reflect Igor's departure 2. Just again, you want to make things easy for the people in your simulation. And then we'd have a turn, and I still have the subtract 3 successes for increasing demands. And then we have our starvation health loss. So after we have fixed the harvest time, right, it makes sense to go ahead and do that before we see if we find Igor, because the person's out looking for him. We don't have his help. It would be weird to kind of resolve the event before the harvest check because he's gone, right? So finding Igor, the person looking for Igor makes a cunning check. If they have at least 1 success, I want to make it easy. They find the son and bring him back. If they find Igor, restore his economic contribution forward and increase food needed, and that would be by 2. Now, I could have had another harvest time, right? I could have said, okay, Igor's back, having a harvest time, but my own sense is that the simulation is already fairly long. But I wanted to get in this kind of fear of each other that was developing, right? When there's not enough food around, people, they get very hungry, they get very upset. And I mentioned how people were afraid to close their, or to lock their, people were afraid and started locking their doors when they hadn't in the past. So I say, okay, now someone is trying to break into your farm. Do you use your cunning to try and persuade them to leave, or do you fight back? And I tell them, if you fight back, your success is based on the number of health counters remaining, right? So people can make a conscious choice, can say, we're healthy and there's a lot of us, let's fight back. Or they could say, we're not very healthy, let's go for cunning. And then I have them roll that many dice and tell them the results. And notice, since I said I had different results based on whether they use cunning or health. So if they use cunning, they manage to trick their arbors. They feel bad. They give you food and wealth. They feel so bad. That kind of thing has happened. If you used health to beat them up, they run away, dropping 1 food and 1 wealth. And basically the idea here is that I give an explanation for whether they're successful or not. And I consider here, cunning. I'm going off the basis of cunning. Cunning typically is 6. So an average result is like 3. So I consider 4, 5, and 6 to be good. If you have 5 or 6, that's really good. If you have more than 5, that's really good. If you have 4 or 5, that's okay. But sufficient. So, in this case, you don't lose anything. But 2 or 3, I said, okay, that's bad. So I said, okay, you lose half your wealth and food counters. If you have none, a family member is beaten. And then if you have less than 6, 2 successes, you lose all health and wealth, and each family member is beaten and loses 1 health. So that's basically the idea. And you can play around with it after you go through play testing to determine how things go. And then I could end it. What I did originally, I say the regime ends the quota system, but you have almost no seed and must survive 1 more season before things are back to normal, end quote. So I said, now you have minus 4 successes. Now, I'm going to decide with playtesting. I may decide this is just too harsh. I may just decide to end with the robbers and just drop the thing here about and just mention it and just say, okay, you survived, but now you have to rebuild in a regime that is hostile to you and will take away your food, knowing that it will kill you. And the only reason they have let you start going back to normal is they realized, well, if we kill all the peasants, we won't have any food. Right? I could end that way, or I could end with this. I'm just going to have to play test it to decide what's the best way to end. And I would just have there, we have the usual thing, and then I had it in bold, subtract the 4 successes for increasing demands. And then we would end it that way. And again, I just have to play it through it a few times on my own and see how I feel about it, how I want it to end. Like I say, this would be, I think, ending it with the actual playing out 1 more turn is the most realistic way to end it. Even when you start getting food in, even when things start kind of getting back to normal, people still suffer during a famine. But I can just tell people that. And if we're near the end of the game, we can do that. And one thing I should also stress is when you're running the simulation, you don't have to always do everything. You may run it with one way and it works just fine. Like you may have a class that really gets it. And so you can include this extra turn. but then you may have a class that's having a little bit more difficulty getting it, in which case you can just end it like how I said and just say, okay, this is what happens. And you don't play that final turn. And it's just up to you, and you just get a feel for the room, you get a sense of where you are at the semester, and you can go from there and end it in a way that you think works best for that particular class.